Hello everyone, my name is Claire Matson. I'm the coordinator for the Thames Valley Learning Partnership. I'd like to thank you all for joining us to this TVLP event for World Environment Day. And we're very lucky to have 3 different speakers with us this afternoon from 3 different organisations talking about different biodiversity issues that affect us all. Our first speaker is going to talk about greening London's urban canals. Our second speaker is going to talk about rethinking city and town flora. And our third speaker is going to talk about the ecological crisis and why biodiversity matters. So let me hand over obviously to Timothy Mulligan. He's the ecologist at the Canal and River Trust, which is a charity. And I think, Timothy, you cover London and the South East. And Timothy will be talking about greening London's urban canals. Over to you, Timothy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'll just share the presentation. Hopefully that's working. Is that all good?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yes, great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Mulligan. I'm of course, the ecologist for the Canal and River Trust, covering London and the South East, but I mainly cover the London area. So I'll start with a little introduction to the Canal and River Trust and who we are. So the Canal and River Trust is a charity who manages 2,000 miles of canals all across the country. As you can see on the map on the right-hand side, they start all the way up near the Lake District and go all the way down to London and Bristol. Now, the Canal and River Trust has gone through a few iterations in its time, but it's now actually a well-being charity. And one of the most important things to people's well-being is biodiversity and access to wildlife, as this has a great positive impact on well-being. Thus, the Trust focuses on improving the natural environment within and around our waterways for all the users and anyone that comes to visit them. So I thought I'd start with a little brief introduction, a history of canals to set the scene. So canals fueled the Industrial Revolution in Britain, built to transport goods quickly through the entire length and breadth of the country. These aided in the creation of wealth by industry, which led to the British Empire during the Victorian era. The golden age of canals was between the 1770s and the 1830s, fueled by a huge public and private investments, whereby 4,000 miles of artificial waterways were dug all across the country, connecting industrial hubs such as Birmingham with London and beyond. Unfortunately, they didn't last for so long. Along came the train, and canals were suddenly the slow, less efficient, more expensive option. Although they never went away, the use and popularity of canals faced steep decline in the second half of the 19th century. After the decline, they fell into disrepair and even dried up, losing nearly half the original length. As you can see on the map on the right-hand side, the brown lines are all the original canals, and if I go quickly back to the map before, they're all that's left. Fortunately, in the 1970s, groups of individuals, passionate volunteers, began restoring the dilapidated waterways. Groups such as the Inland Waterway Association, who are still active today, repurposed them from their industrial freight-driven origins to leisure-dominant canals. These canals have a diverse range of activities that people engage in, such as boating holidays, kayaking, fishing, walking, cycling, and even if you look up in the top left-hand corner, there's even floating hot tubs that you can hire out for journeys up the Regent's Canal. Today's canal environment is quite dramatically different from those of the origins. As you can see on the left-hand side, most of the canal towpaths were heavily eroded by horse-drawn traffic, and there wasn't the thought to include trees and habitat for wildlife. Sorry about that. But nowadays, you can see on the right-hand side, there's hedgerows and diverse wildflower-rich grasslands, woodlands. We've even got protected sites in London. There's the Brent Reservoir is a special site of special scientific interest for its overwintering waterfowl, and has some huge numbers of great crested grebes, some which are nationally recognised. With many of London's rivers now buried beneath the tarmac, the reimagined waterways are providing vital, important green-blue infrastructure for wildlife. These are important aquatic ecosystems which support a wide range of wildlife. As you can see from these photographs, these are just a few of the species that we'll find on canals. So in the top left-hand corner, you'll see the kingfisher, which is the iconic king of the waterways. You might be lucky enough to see the blue flash fly past you on the canals in the early mornings, hunting for their food. With many fish in the canal, so in top centre is perch. There's large numbers of perch, pike, bream, carp, roach, all sorts of coarse fish across the network. We even have some protected species like bats, for example. The dark canal corridors, which are rich in vegetation and aquatic habitat, provide excellent foraging grounds for bats. The insects that emerge from the water are the bat's predominant food. So one of the really important things about the dark space of canals is that we get lots of bats. Also water voles, the bottom middle picture there, could be confused as a rat, but they're generally a bit chunkier and a bit more elusive as well. We actually have these in quite urban centres in Oxford, and up in the top right-hand corner, as you can see the otter there, we've got reports of those on the Grand Union Canal, and also as close in the centre of the city as the Olympic Park on the River Lee. Now, London's canals, generally, the London and South East region is quite large. I haven't got a map of the full thing, but what we consider as London's canals is generally from about Rickmansworth, going down to the Thames on the east, on the west side, going across to the River Lee at Enfield and down. So the canals that we have here, we've got the Grand Union that runs all the way down here, down to Brentford, and which connects to the Thames. Got the Slough Arm, which meets Slough and meets the Grand Union Canal at Eusleigh. The Grand Union Paddington Arm, which runs from Southall all the way to Paddington. The Regent's Canal, which runs from Paddington all the way down to Poplar and meeting the Thames down at this end. The River Lee, a little Hertford Union Canal there, that's a little fast connection, and the Limehouse Cut. Now, the modern day has presented new modern pressures on wildlife on the canals, so I'll just run through some of these with you. The top left-hand corner photograph is a photo of docklands, actually taken next to one of our docks, which are in the network there. Now, building developments are having a huge impact on wildlife on the canals, mainly due to shading. There's also issues with their construction, but the buildings are tending to go very high, very close to the canal, which is causing problems for zooplankton species like Daphnia, who rely on sunlight in the waterways. Now, Daphnia provide the food source for a huge number of animals within the food chain. Another huge impact on wildlife on the canals is displayed here by a huge stack of speakers. Noise is a big impact. This can really impact nesting sites for birds and bats. It generally disrupts wildlife around the canals. Light is another huge impact, especially with nocturnal species such as bats. Now, bats can actually see. They're not as blind as they're made out to be, but they have very sensitive eyes, and bright lights disturb their foraging pathways and can also impact the food that they're feeding on. If you ever see a light bulb outside or a light outside and see how many moths and insects go to it, you find that they're getting attracted away from the sites where bats will be foraging. And another big impact on the right-hand side is pollution. This photo was taken back in 2018, where 40,000 gallons of used engine oil was dumped into the River Lee via a surface water drain. This had devastating effects on wildlife, huge fish kills. We had lots of birds impacted. We had the Swan Sanctuary and the Environment Agency, our contractors and volunteers out there saving birds and cleaning up the spill. Other less likely issues or less known about pressures on canals are also found in invasive species, non-native invasive species. So we can see some of the photos there. The top left being giant hogweed, gives you these horrible rashes. Japanese knotweed, as you can see there, breaking through tarmac. And the bottom left here is a species called floating pennywort, which clogs up canals and prevents other plants from photosynthesizing and in turn deoxygenating the water. So it's not all greening is good greening. So we spend a lot of time removing and treating these species, which have knock-on effects for wildlife on the canals, because the amount of money that is spent treating these species is taking away from habitat improvement projects and works that the trust would like to be doing. Other species, like at the bottom, you've got mink, which they look a little bit like otters, but the American mink at the bottom center, and the signal crayfish, which are both pivotal in the reduction in. So with otters, it's the water voles that are heavily predated by them, and on the right, the signal crayfish has actually spread a disease to our native white claw crayfish, which has led to a huge decline. So, greening the urban blue-green corridors. So urban greening, by definition, is the way in which public landscaping projects create mutually beneficial relationships between the people and their environment. So how does this impact society? Well, as you can see, this is an image of a greening project in Boston, which some of our contractors have been working on. And the vision here, it shows you a much improved aesthetic than the hard concrete edges that you would normally see in cities. And what the findings from this is the improving and including more greening projects into cities is that you get safer places with less crime. There's generally less litter. People are more engaged with the environment, and most importantly, more wildlife and beautiful spaces for tranquility. So I'm going to go on to some projects that I've been working on over the past few years with urban greening. This first project, Oxbow Island, which is it was originally it was actually the top left-hand photo is a photo from a map from the early 1800s, where it shows the island connected to the western bank of the river. and it was actually a park. However, with the straightening of the canal, as you can see going through at the bottom photograph, the island was created, and slowly the eastern bank of it silted up, and created a backwater habitat. Now, over the years, this site has actually been used for dredging, dumping from taking material out of the canal, and it was generally a site that was a bit unloved. When I approached the site, there was a lot of antisocial behaviour, people having parties, setting fires. There was huge amounts of fly tipping, lots of invasive species. Now, what we've been doing over the last 3 years is replanting the site. So we've removed a lot of invasive species, replanted with native trees, wildflowers, and if I come off this video, we've also created marginal wetland habitat, which is great for invertebrates, amphibians, fish, and with the flowering plants that we have in them, great for pollinators such as bees and butterflies. Another project that I've been working on is the Hanwell Flight Green Flag project. Now, the Hanwell Flight is near to the end of the Grand Union Canal, just above Brentford, and the Hanwell Flight is a listed ancient monument, which is actually on the heritage at risk list due to the amount of vegetation that has taken over and has been damaging the historic fabric, which is a set of side ponds and locks. So what we've been doing is we've been changing the vegetation within these areas, within the side ponds. So as you can see on the top left-hand photograph, there's lots of brambles and there's ivy, and previous to this photograph, there's actually lots of saplings and trees growing out of it, which were cracking the stone and mortar that these structures were built with. After removing them, we replanted them with wildflower plugs, and included quite a novel approach to habitat enhancements, which are floating ecosystems. You can see at the bottom here. And here's a little video of us installing them. Now, the floating ecosystems are an excellent habitat enhancement for canals, because as I was saying earlier about these hard-edged canals, nature can't really take hold, and where nature can't take hold, there's no habitat for wildlife. The birds can't nest, fish can't spawn, invertebrates can't get out of the water if they need to. What these do, these are actually floating rafts that are planted full of wetland plants, both flowering, non-flowering plants, which filter the water, create habitat for fish to spawn, lay their eggs on. Also areas for pollinators flowering plants, so pollinators like bees and butterflies can pollinate and thrive. Also, also they're great for birds that need some nesting habitat, which they generally find quite difficult on the canals because of the amount of boats and hard edges. So these are photos actually that were taken the other week of the slides previously. So if you look at the left hand side, this looks like a natural berm or a natural edge to the pond, but in fact it's just those structures that have been fully matured and colonized by these plants. You can see on the right hand side here, you've got the wildflowers with the red campion that's coming out at this time of the year. The last project I'll talk about is greening the Regent's Canal. Now this has been this is a collaborative project that we've been working with a couple of community groups, the Lower Regents Coalition and the Wildlife Gardeners of Haggerston, that are based on the Regent's Canal. Also the Environment Agency and Thames 21. And what we're doing is we're looking to create a green corridor throughout much of the Regent's Canal. If you have a look at the photo to the bottom left, you've got sheep piling, very hard edges. There's not much wildlife within, not much wildlife habitat within the canals. You've got paved towpaths all the way to the edge of the bank. So what we're doing here is including these floating ecosystems to create a naturalized setting for wildlife. So the photograph on the left-hand side here is one that was installed about a year ago. It was just before we went into lockdown, actually. And you can see how well that's matured. And on the right-hand side, this was literally installed last Thursday, just at the Regent's Canal around Hackney. 2 were installed there, and we've got another one going in at the bottom as well. And what we've found with including these within the environment is that we're finding that more birds, we're having a higher recruitment of birds, small birds, and chicks, sorry. As you can see in this photograph here, these are perfect habitat for young birds, providing cover and sanctuary for them. But also with the numbers of fish, that we're seeing a great increase in fish populations from the increased habitat for spawning. I'd just like to say as well that urban greening it's not just about including green space in terms of trees and vegetation, but also creating habitat for wildlife. So as much as tree planting and wildflower planting and floating ecosystems are extremely important, some species require something a little bit different. So in the right-hand side photo here, we've got a kingfisher nest box, and you can see there's a couple of little holes just in the bottom band of sand there, where some kingfishers have gone in and burrowed in and checked the place out. And there's other inclusions as well that we ensure that we're including within our habitat enhancements, such as bug hotels and bird and bat boxes. Sorry. So the Canal and River Trust work with a wide range of groups and people, from regulators such as the Environment Agency to other charities such as Thames 21, and other partners such as Lee Valley Parks and the Inland Waterways Association. The people that saved the canals originally work very closely with the Canal and River Trust to keep that momentum up and keep the passion and interest in the waterways. We also work very closely with local councils and local government to ensure that we are all working together to include biodiversity and habitat improvements around our canals that connect to other environments within the areas that our canals run through. We work a huge amount with local communities and schools to clean the canals, also with volunteers to help manage boat movements. Also, a lot of the projects that I work on are completely volunteer led, and we really see that the collaboration is the most effective way to have continued support and collective ownership, which supports sustainability and promotes the legacy of canals and the wildlife and wildlife within them. So last one is really a call to action. Myself personally and the trust would really love for more young people to come and get involved with us. We've got so many interesting volunteering opportunities, from working on boats, planting forests and woodland hedgerows, hedge laying, litter picking, and grappling out some of the huge items of debris that invariably end up in canals. and also working with me on some of my floating ecosystem projects. So this is a photograph from the other day. You can see the volunteers just down at the far end after we built these things and planted them up. So yes, that's all from me. If you have any questions.
Lovely, thank you, Tim. I found it absolutely fascinating seeing the different projects that you're working on and finding out about the floating habitats. It's a great idea. If anyone has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And also, like I said at the beginning as well, if you have any suggestions for changes that you would like to see at your school or in your local community, maybe some of the changes that our biodiversity improvements that Tim mentioned during his talk, then feel free to add those to the chat option as we're gathering information to see what changes we can implement. Thank you so much for your time, Tim. Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I hope to see you around the canal sometime, maybe.
Definitely. Great. Thank you. So our next speaker now is Sophie Leguil, who is, well, you are the founder, aren't you, of #MoreThanWeeds, and a very knowledgeable lady. So thank you so much for joining us. Sophie's going to be talking about rethinking city and town flora. So Sophie, over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for having me. So today I'm going to be talking about weeds. So I really enjoy, the previous speakers talk about canals, because this is one of the area, along rivers where you can see quite a few, wildflowers. But my talk is going to focus more specifically about those plants that we don't want to see, those plants that we don't like to see in our cities. And I'm going to start by sharing a little picture. So this is a street in East London, quite a standard street with a mix of housing, Victorian terrace, some parking, some tree pits. And this street has the particularity of being part of a trial. So that particular council has tried an area where they've stopped spraying. They've stopped removing the plants with, chemical produced like glyphosate. And so the look of the street is very different from what we are used to seeing. So the question really is, when you look at a street like this, if you walked in a street like this, do you see weeds or do you see wildflowers? And it's a very interesting question to ask ourselves, because it has huge impact on how we see, wildlife in our cities. Last year, we saw many, headlines, newspaper headlines, saying that plants were making a comeback in our cities. So this was an article from the Daily Mail about grass growing between cobblestones on Italy's plaza, historic plazas. They had grass growing between the cobblestones. And even in the UK, this is someone tweeting from Colchester saying, how lovely it was to have some white flowers in the street. This was a result, obviously, of COVID, because many councils stopped spraying. They didn't send their operators out in the street because it wasn't safe. So bizarrely, we started seeing all that wildlife growing and all those plants growing on our streets. And it was very different to what we were used to. But this year, we are back to spraying. You may have noticed that in your local street that the plants are being, removed. Most of the time, they are removed through glyphosate, which is the most used weed killer in the UK and around the world. Sometimes they are also brushed or removed with alternative methods like hot water. So if you use very hot water, that will kill the plants. The plant cells will obviously collapse and the plants will be killed. So really, we've seen a change from last year to this year again. And the question is, what is a weed? Why are we seeing those plants as weeds, and why are they undesirable? So a weed is usually a plant that is seen as undesirable in a particular situation. So a plant in the wrong place. And in our cities, we grow plants. We were talking about Tim was talking about, trees. We choose to grow plants in places. We have plants in our gardens, we have parks. But in some other places, we choose to remove them. This is a picture from Canary Wharf. And you can see quite clearly that you've got the trees, which are very well, separated, and all the rest around is very mineral. There is no trace of green all around it. So we have obviously chosen, that this is the look we want our cities to have. But were our cities always that way? Was weed removal always that way? Or in the past, did our cities have more plants and spontaneous plants growing in, all around? So I started looking a little bit into the history of it, because I think it's very interesting. We think about our cities nowadays, but we don't necessarily think about how they were before. And so this is actually a picture from Paris, but as you can see, there are not many plants around. And looking into this, I actually found out that pretty early on, from Middle Ages and even after that, in the Tudor times as well, weeding was technically undertaken by slaves or women or children, so it was a low-paid, very high labor intensive work, but it was seen as being, obviously a sign of a city being opulent and having enough money to have people doing that sort of job. In the 19th century, with the expansion of cities, a city like London expanded massively in the 19th century. So there were more cobblestone, there was more, mineral places around, and people started to look for chemical alternatives to remove all those very injurious weeds. So this is an extract from, a recipe found in a 19th century book, where they explain, with dodgy chemicals in the 19th century, like sulfur, lime. So you put that in an iron cauldron, and that will purge the soil of rebel herbs for several years. So, those plants were obviously seen as something to destroy and to kill. But to some other people, weeds were opportunities. So the engraving on the left, actually, is from a book about London. And this man here, I don't know if you can read, but the man is called the groundsel man. So groundsel is a very common, weed that you find on pavements, in parks, in gardens, from the daisy family. I haven't put a picture, but it's quite a common plant. It turns out that it's actually a very, very nutritious plant for birds. And so you had these men, it was obviously, men, children, groundsel men, who would go around, collect all the weeds from, people's gardens, from the parks, from the streets, to clean all the weeds, and they would sell them. So they would have these little baskets on their back of bunches of weeds that they would be selling to rich Victorian families who loved having caged birds. So, they had all sorts of birds like goldfinches and all, other caged birds. And those birds absolutely enjoy that, that food. So those men, would go around. So there was this bit of an economy around, weeds, which is very interesting, because nowadays, weed removal costs enormous amount of money to councils all around the world. So it was, interesting to see how they were, valued in those times. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to, to go back to that, because it was very labor intensive. So at the turn of the century, that's where, chemical appeared, especially at the turn of the war. So there were very, very dangerous ones, like Eureka, which you can see an ad here, and that contained arsenic. And in some places, people got poisoned, the soils got poisoned. So people were eating vegetables and getting, poisoned because there were traces of it in the grounds. Then appeared in the 1970s, so well after the war, glyphosate, which is, the weed killer, which is still used nowadays because it's very cheap, very easy to use, and it works very well. I mean, there's, no denying about that. So as I said before, weed is a plant considered undesirable in a particular situation. But how many weeds, are around us? I mean, you walk in a street, you may not even notice them. And this is the thing, last year people started seeing weeds growing slightly taller, so they noticed them a bit more. So what we have to ask ourselves is how many different habitats there are in a city. So this is just a bit of London, South London, which, I took a random bit of South London, but it could be, it could be anywhere in the UK. And what you can see here is many different habitats in a very, very small place. So cities are actually places of opportunities for wildlife, because in a small area, you have so many different habitats in that tiny place, compared to the countryside, where you may have I don't know, a chalk grassland reserve, which is going to be spanning for acres and acres. So you will have a lot of species, but not much diversity. Whereas in a city, for example, you have a riverbed. So in London, because the river is slightly salty, you will have plants that like salt. Then you have private gardens, which will have shrubs and flowers and, for bees and things like that. You will have ponds, this is large ponds. In parks, you can see some woodlands, with taller trees and some shady areas. You can have a park. Obviously, you have the river, which was, exposed in the previous talk, and the canals and the river, which again bring a completely different habitat, and that's very interesting. Tree pits is another one. We always talk about the trees as being really good. We need to plant more trees in our cities for shade and cooling, but actually the pits, at the bottom of the tree are also very interesting. You'll find all sorts of different plants in there. So I've highlighted a few which are very common, but you may have, all sorts of plants growing in there, and they all contribute, to creating a healthy ecosystem in our cities. So in total, how many plants are there? It's thought that around 2,000 plants occur on pavements in the UK. So this was, a figure from a 1983 book of the Flora of London. There was a Flora of London which was published. So this is an estimate. It can vary. Obviously, not all of those are common, but I think it's very interesting to think about the fact, that our cities hold more diversity than much of our countryside. And I think that's something that we shouldn't be ignoring. We shouldn't just be dismissing plants in our cities as all our cities as being concrete and grey. They have opportunity for wildlife to thrive. Garden plants can escape too, and I thought that was a very interesting example. So this is a plant that you often see in hanging baskets, around pubs or shops, sometimes, municipal planting. This is called a lobelia. And what is particularly interesting is that plant actually comes from South Africa. It comes from mountains. So on the right here, you can see that same plant growing on the pavement. And actually many of our, urban plants, many of our pavement and urban plants come from rocky or dry places. And so it kind of mimics their natural environments. And I think that's quite interesting, and something that you wouldn't expect a plant from South Africa to spontaneously thrive on the pavements of a city. But this is what happens around us, and we don't notice it. What weeds can teach us is also very important. So there's obviously those plants, some of them are natives, which is, you will call them wildflowers. A dandelion is a good example. This is a native plant in the UK. You'll find it in garden, nature reserves, and pavements. But many of the other plants that we find in cities are actually not native. They've been brought to the UK many centuries ago or more recently. And even nowadays the flora is changing because we keep bringing new plants. I mean, this is one of my, at the bottom here you can see one of my trainers, and you can see those little seeds sticking on it. So when you go somewhere, you go on holiday, you may have some seeds sticking to your shoes and bring them back to the UK or move them around without even noticing. Car tires, birds as well. Sometimes you get a random plant growing somewhere. It's possibly because a bird has been, feeding, and obviously, the seed went through his digestive system and ends up somewhere else. Train is another one. I mean, the buddleia is a really good example. Very common plant along railways. If you take the train, sometimes you'll see it, all along the rails. And the plants are spreading with trains. We move plants around with trains in the UK and elsewhere in the world. So I think that's quite fascinating. And plants can also teach us about history. So, I mean, you can't really see that picture because it's very poor quality down there. But this is from the Barbican estate in London before it was rebuilt in the 1950s, 60s. And because it had been bombed during the war in a 1940-ish, around that decade, a plant started growing. So it's called Rose Bay Willow Herb. And it's a plant that absolutely loves fire, bomb sites, places with, with a lot of fire and ash. And so it started growing in huge quantities around the Barbican. And there's actually here a herbarium specimen, from that plant collected at that time because it was so abundant. So I actually spoke to someone who said that she got married in the 1950s, and all the background was completely pink with that, around the Barbican was completely pink with that plant, which I think, is quite interesting. The fact that plants are also linked to our history. Birdseed is another way that plants spread in the UK. And, we think about, maybe some of you, have got bird feeders, or you got, people who who've got bird feeders in their garden. It's a very common hobby. But actually, the seeds are not necessarily native. So some of the cheap seed mixes that we can buy actually come from places like China. And there's been more and more cases, in the past few years of people actually, having strange plants growing under their bird feeders, because that has been seed from, China or South America sprouting. And there's about 400, different plants in the UK which have been introduced just by people having bird feeders, which, something, again, that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Our flora, well, it's changing. I've, spoken about car tires, plants moving around. Some plants are disappearing, where others are increasing. And I think that's quite reassuring. We often have really bad news about the environment, saying things are disappearing, there's, biodiversity loss and crisis, which is true. But there are also sometimes some good news. And Jersey cudweed, for example, it's not a very, pretty plant, something that you would grow in your garden. But it was very, very rare. And we don't know really why, whether it's climate change and warming. But it seems to be, growing back in London. It's spreading. It's really expanding its range in London and in the south, southeast of the UK as in general. So that there are changes like that, and potentially by studying those plants, it could help us, understand climate change a little bit better, and we can also find some, better plants to plant in our gardens. So, for example, on the left here, Mexican fleabane. This is a plant that was introduced by the Victorians because they loved how it looked in a garden. It looked quite pretty. And this is a really good plant for, when you have a drought in summer. It resists, it doesn't need any water. So when you think about, the fact that we have things like water challenges, drought being more frequent, potentially having some of those plants around could really help, having more resources for pollinators, for example, in summer, and not needing as much water in our gardens. So, that's an example of a plant. You can see the spread in just, over 10 years. Initially, it was just scattered around the UK, and now it's turned out to be, in almost every city in the UK. So there are changes happening, and I think, we have to monitor them. Tim talked about, invasive plants. And I think by monitoring those plants in cities, we can also understand, invasions better and prevent those plants from, clogging our canals or posing health risks as well. So why are plants usually removed? I've spoken about that diversity. So why do you remove them? The main reason is people saying, those plants look dirty, it looks neglected, because there are plants, growing spontaneously. So it's kind of nature taking over. Some people always, also think that they attract pests. Some people think they cause allergies, which is true for things like grasses. Some grasses can actually cause allergy if you have hay fever. But it's not, it has to be a huge quantity for it to be a problem. And, some people also think those plants are actually ugly. But, is this something that we really should be considering? Or are we at a time where we need to also consider the potential benefits of those plants? And that's, that's where I want to come at, really. Could these weeds actually be useful for us in our cities? Should we be looking at them in a different way? And obviously there are many, benefits that those tiny plants can bring. One of them is food for insects. You know, that's quite obvious. You see bumblebees and bees pollinating those flowers. But those plants are also useful when they're not in flower. And I'll show you why a little bit later. They absorb pollution. We don't tend to think of them as this way, and as absorbing pollution. But actually, some of our pavement plants are very, very efficient at capturing pollutants. They can be a source of new medicines. Again, something we think we have to go to rainforests to, find new plants and going into jungles, undiscovered jungles. But some very common pavement, plants that you'll find on pavements are being studied. There are clinical trials to find out whether they could have any medicinal properties and whether we could use them. And some can actually be pretty. Or, this is very obviously, this is personal and this is per preference. Some people love dandelions in their lawn where others really hate them. So plants are vital for insects, but they're vital in two different ways. So when a plant, when an insect pollinates the plants, obviously, that insect gets its food for it, but also there are indirect effects. So, we talk about bees pollinating orchards and the fact that we need bees to have apples and, vegetables, things like that. And that's also an effect, because if you have more insects, then you have more fruit and you have more food for birds. So it's like this whole chain is, becomes healthier and more food for everyone somehow. We also, we often hear about plants for pollinators, but many plants, and as I said before, many plants are actually useful before they are even in flower. So the caterpillars of many insects need the leaves. They don't care about the flowers. The caterpillar actually need the plant before it flowers. And a really good example of that is the nettle. So the nettle actually is needed by the caterpillars and the larvae of more than 40 different insects. So if you cut your nettle, thinking, oh, that I really hate nettles, they sting and they're really annoying. Well, actually, you might, that whole population of insects might go extinct because you've just cut that nettle. So I think it's really important also to think about, we think about weeds and we need pretty plants, but actually we also need plants, that are actual food for insects. And for the whole cycle of those insects. And I'm obviously going to introduce two different complicated words, which is oligophagous versus polyphagous. And what I mean by that is the fact that we think about, oh, this is a really pretty garden, it's got lots of flowers for insects. But actually, some insects really rely on, a single plant species to get their food. I've spoken about the nettle. Some insects are even worse than that. They need that particular plant, otherwise they just can't survive. So I think, if we could have more diversity of plants in our cities, and including some unpretty or ugly plants, then we could really, improve biodiversity as a whole, because you'd have more, more diversity of insects and birds as well. Bird food, coming to that. We all, we think about, birds as needing little insects and caterpillars and things like that. But actually, many of our plants are really good for them. So the poppy, this is actually opium poppy, which you may find in your, in your local streets, because it's a really good food for birds. The birds love those, seed pods and those seeds, so they disperse them all around. And that's a really good example. And sometimes the plant names actually, tell us the story of a particular plant. So there's a plant called chickweed, which is very common in on pavements, and also on lawns in parks. And it's called chickweed because birds absolutely love it. It's full of vitamin C, so they actually love eating the seeds and the leaves. So can we learn to live with those plants? I think I've demonstrated somehow that they have uses in various uses for us, but also for wildlife. So can we learn to live with them? Initiatives to let plants live are spreading. So I showed you at the beginning a picture of a street in East London, in Hackney, where they've decided to stop spraying. But 98% of councils in the UK still use weed killer. So there is a long way to go, before there is a little more acceptance. So those pictures actually come from France, where there is a little more acceptance of those. In the UK, I think it's a longer process. So you can see here, two pictures, one in Rome and another one in Lyon, so quite a big city in France, where they've actually turned this whole thing around. They've banned pesticides, and they've said, if there are plants in your streets, it's normal, it's fine, life is coming back. And with that, they did those really interesting billboards with a bit of art, around them, which I think is very interesting, because we need to, if we want our cities in the future to be healthier, both for wildlife and for humans as well, we need to be slightly more relaxed about those things. It doesn't have to be, and I think it's very important to point out that it's not about letting everything grow and not controlling anything. You don't want things to look completely neglected, but just having a few more plants either in the streets or in the tree pits, greening the tree pits, or letting some of the verges. That picture here in Rome on the left. You can see they've left the plants grow slightly taller. And that makes a huge difference. That will make a huge difference to the local, as a local habitat to birds and insects. So I started More Than Weeds last year. I launched this project because I wanted to make people realize, and I wanted people to think about the way we see those urban plants. So I've been doing guided walks and some campaigning, and the idea really is to show people that it's possible to manage them, but in a better way, a way that is, friendlier for the environment, and also, better for us. So I started by chalking, the name of those plants on the pavements. And it was very interesting because people, stopped me in the street and they were saying, oh, I had no idea that this plant was called shepherd's purse. So, I showed them the plant and I said, this is called shepherd's purse because of the shape of the fruit, for example. And I think, many of us, and I'm no different, we have, lost that connection with plants. We don't need to rely on plants as we used to in the past for food, for medicine, to scour our pans. There was a plant used in London in the 19th century because it's got very rough leaves, and it was used to clean pans, for example. This is not something that we need to rely on now. So the plants have kind of, gone in the background. We may, put some food for birds, or look at birds and even look at bees and insects in our garden. But we've kind of lost that connection with all our wild plants. So what can we do? Well, first thing I would say is, if you're interested, there are plenty of resources out there. It can look quite scary. You find a plant, you have no idea what it is. There are books, but aside of books, there are also new technologies which are really, really useful and which can be quite fun. So there are several apps which you can use, like iSpot or iNaturalist. You can use them with your phone. So you just download an app, take a picture of a plant, and then people all around the world. So there's this kind of big community. And those people will, tell you why your plant is, I don't know, hedge mustard or something like that. And so there's this kind of fun way of learning. And also what you are doing is helping science, because all that data is shared, with scientists. So let's say you have a scientist from, Natural History Museum, and they want to know how a plant is faring or how it's moving around in the UK. They will be able to do that with, the data that everyone sends. So I think it's very, it's very common, and also it's very important, and also for common plants. We don't think about, I don't know, some plants like the daisies, being threatened or things like that. But in the long term, we have no idea how things are going to evolve. So it's very important, for science also, to be able to follow things over time. And finally, you know, as I said before, if you have a garden, or, you know, a local park, and, you know, leaving just a little corner of those canals that we call weeds. So, you know, you've got things like clover, herb robert, chickweed, those plants which are very common, but which can make a huge difference. So if you have a garden, just leaving a little corner of those, you know, a few nettles in a corner where it's not causing a problem. Or if you don't, you know, lobbying your council and your local park to leave just a little area, you know, and not mown or mown less regularly, can make a huge difference. So I hope you enjoy my talk. I'm, you know, obviously I'm passionate about plants, and I think, you know, they deserve to be, you know, as widely known and as widely studied as, you know, potentially birds or mammals. Because, you know, we are all interconnected, and I think that's very important to realise on a day like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie. That was fascinating. I think you made some really valuable points there across a variety of different subjects. You know, things like the dandelion, which we all kind of tend to think of as a weed. You know, it's edible and it's actually quite good for us. We can put the flowers and the leaves in our salads, or we can, you know, cook it like spinach. But how many of us actually know that, for example?
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned that, because you know, where I come from in the northeast France, dandelions are actually sold in the supermarkets. You know, we find them in supermarkets as a normal veg. So, you know, obviously different cultures also, you know, have different approaches to what weed is. And I think that's
yes. Perfect. Well, you know, I've got chamomile out on my front drive, and it's just popped up like just out of the blue. And if I didn't know what that was, I would be pulling it up, but instead I'm picking off the flowers and putting them in my tea, because that's very good for us. So, you know, things like that. So again, when it comes to our students logging in right now and watching this at a later date, you know, if there's a project that you would like to do at your school in terms of an education project where we can have signage, we can hopefully have an area dedicated to weeds, as it were, but kind of showing the benefits of those, whether that will be you know, from insects or bird perspective, or, you know, edible weeds, for example. You know, if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to put it in the chat option. And also at the end of this talk, I'll be sending out a feedback form. So that's another opportunity. If you want to send me some of your ideas for changes that we can make in terms of weeds and different plants, then yes, please do feel free to make most of that opportunity. Great. Thank you, Sophie, so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, someone said about the identification apps that I mentioned. You know, there are a few. I've got a list, you know, with explanation and things on my website. So, you know, if you want to have a look at that, then that may help. And some links to, you know, the App Store as well, so you can download them directly.
Lovely, perfect. And Merit has just said as well that Eton College has been planning an initiative for letting the verges of fields grow out. So they're interested in rewilding and letting weeds kind of establish, as it were, so they can obviously see the benefits of that. So again, that's something which, you know, some of our other schools might want to get involved with at their school, and we can kind of share information. At the end of, obviously, our biodiversity project, which this webinar is part of, we will be producing biodiversity booklets. So I can include those apps that you've mentioned that you can send over to us into the booklet as well, because it's going to be a resource of different information, and hopefully some of our students will want to contribute to that as well. So write a different article, or, you know, however they want to kind of get involved. So great. Oh, and I've got another thing up as well in the chat, and it says the Eton Town Council is supporting for no mow verges too, which is great. So it's nice to see that in Berkshire, some of the councils are kind of recognising, you know, the benefits of letting things grow naturally, as it were, and rather than keeping it cut down to the ground. Lovely. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right, I hope you all enjoyed that. So our next speaker now is George Fussey from Eton College. George, I think you're the curator of the college's Natural History Museum, aren't you? And you're going to be talking to us about the ecological crisis that we face in terms of biodiversity. So without further ado, let me pass over to George now. Thank you, George.
Great. Well, I hope you can see my screen, everybody. And what two great talks to follow. My talk is a little bit more about the global crisis that we face, and is trying to understand what it means to lose that biodiversity. So my subtitle is Losing Nemo, Not Finding Nemo, and that's really our issue. So let me start with a definition, which is that biodiversity describes the number and the variety and the variability of living organisms in a particular place, or it can be global. And biodiversity can be something about the genes that the population has. It can be about the species biodiversity, which we've sort of been looking at with the two talks we had earlier. And it can be about ecosystems and the diversity that they have as well. So why are we worried about this? Why am I talking about this? We're losing species and we're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate. And it's driven by humans. So it's something that we need to know about and something we can do something about. We are depleting our natural resources. We're polluting the planet. We are taking with us species from one country to another and introducing them, sometimes deliberately and sometimes unwittingly, and they challenge the species which already live there. I think we all know about climate change and the acidification of our oceans, and of course there is damage to habitat, which I think we're all too aware of, with projects like HS2, for instance, and the worries that we have with that. So biodiversity is really important, and I want to make a case for why should we really be concerned? What is the value of biodiversity, and why should we worry about losing it? I can recommend this website to you. It's the Earlham Institute, and there's a great website you can have a look at. It says, why should you care about biodiversity? If you want to have a look at that, then I would recommend it. So what's the problem? Okay, well, let me just give you some facts, if you like, or factoids, you might call them. So we cut down huge tracts of forest, mainly rainforest, equivalent to the area the size of Greece, and we are dumping 8 million tons of plastic into the ocean every year. By 2050, we're going to have to increase our food production by 70% to feed the human population. We lose, though, 40% of our crops to pests and disease and flooding and drought. And we have this global warming problem, which obviously is really creating climate change and warming our oceans, which is going to destroy coral. And if I have time, I'll just talk a little bit about coral reefs, because I think they're a really interesting case. So tropical rainforest destruction is huge. It seems to be getting worse in places like Brazil, and we are losing, as we said, an area the size of Greece or Netherlands every year in 2019, 2020. And that's twice the amount of carbon emitted than from all the cars in the US. So we're releasing carbon into the atmosphere, and as you know, those greenhouse gases raise the temperature of the planet. Now, don't worry about this huge text wall that I've put in front of you. But I just want you to be aware that this is the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, and speaking earlier this year. And I just want to bring attention to what he says. He's launching a report in this case, Making Peace with Nature. But just listen to what he says. He says, I want to be clear, without nature's help, we will not thrive or even survive. For too long, we've been waging a senseless and suicidal war on nature. The result is 3 crises: climate disruption, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And I think sometimes people get a little bit confused and think it's all about the climate crisis or so on. What's really important is to realize that there is a climate crisis, but that also then fuels loss of biodiversity. And they're 2 different things, an ecological crisis, if you will, and a climate crisis. And then we have all the problems with pollution as well. All 3 of them, of course, contribute together to really create problems. So here's some more stark figures. Sorry, this is ruining your evening. Okay, UK farmland bird populations decreased by 56% between 1970 and 2015. Studies in German Nature Reserves showed a decline of flying insects by 76% between 1989 and 2016. We have about 5 to 10 million species on the planet. We only got around to describing 2 million of them. And the sad thing is that many of them will go extinct before we get around to describing them. We seem to be losing between 0.01 and 0.1% of species per year. Doesn't sound like a lot, maybe, but actually it's catastrophic depending on what those species are. And the number of threatened species, species that we think are going to be seriously endangered, is up catastrophically again, but almost double from the year 2000. So sometimes people talk about we are living through the 6th mass extinction. And if you look back through the fossil record, you can see previous mass extinctions, some of which are quite familiar to us. The extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, which is, if you're looking at the right of the screen, it's the first yellow triangle there. But we are responsible for what will be a catastrophic mass extinction on our planet of a scale which is happening much faster than the previous mass extinctions. So, you know, how many times faster is this extinction than the one which happened, the previous mass extinction? The answer is about 100 times more rapid, the rate of extinction. Okay, and that's for all groups: amphibians, for mammals, for birds, and vertebrates, and so on. So it really is sort of a catastrophic issue, and the amount of extinction of species which are recognized as, you know, by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the numbers of those species which are at risk are clearly rapidly increasing. And, you know, it doesn't really matter which groups you look at. It seems to be that, you know, 40% of amphibians, and 33% of reef corals, and 30% of sharks, and 25% of mammals, 14% of birds are all at risk of extinction. And once we've lost them, they're gone for good. So here is a website. I'll give you the links at the end of the talk. This is an organization called earth.org, talking about the 6th mass extinction of wildlife is accelerating. This is June 2020, this article. So really, really important. So of the known species, how fast are they disappearing? We think 100 to 1,000 times the rate that existed before humans existed. So we are being, you know, the responsible agents for a catastrophic decline. So I wonder if you heard of HIPPO. Okay, so HIPPO is a way of remembering the real important factors that lead to species loss and biodiversity loss. So HIPPO stands for habitat destruction, invasive and introduced species, pollution, population, so effects on population, and overharvesting and overhunting and poaching and that sort of thing. So that's our HIPPO. And let me just very quickly go through HIPPO. So habitat destruction and fragmentation is about cutting down forests, putting roads through forests, clearing forests for urban use, for agricultural use, and so on. And we're losing something like 1% of the world's tropical forest every year. Invasive species are species that are taken around the world, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident. For example, a very good example is the 24 rabbits which were introduced into Australia in 1859 because people from Europe wanted something to hunt, and they very quickly, because they had no predators, they very quickly increased and have caused extinctions of a number of species across the continent. Population, it is really the effect of global population, the fact that there are more humans and more settlements, more urbanization, increasing and encroaching onto forest. And pollution, I think we all are aware through the work of the BBC, you know, and Blue Planet and so on, how the amount of plastic that's being released into the oceans is disastrous. But of course, there are other pollutants there. And overharvesting, overhunting, we are decreasing our fish stocks. Over 3/4 of them are overexploited. More than 1,000 rhinos, tens of thousands of elephants are killed each year to feed a demand for illegal trade in ivory and rhino horn. And pangolins, which maybe you've heard of because of the COVID crisis, are the most trafficked mammal in the world. Poachers kill 2.7 million African pangolins every year. So there's a huge illegal trade there. So looking at species like the red panda, we're down to a population less than 10,000. Why? Because of deforestation, habitat loss, fragmentation, and poaching for the fur in this case. And something like the Amur tiger, which lives in the east of Russia and in some parts of China, poaching is a real issue there. Habitat destruction, logging, construction of roads and forest fires. Sometimes the destruction doesn't have to be that much. Fragmenting a forest, not just cutting the whole thing down, but just cutting it up into smaller areas can really be damaging. It can take a little bit longer for the extinction to happen, but it can be really disastrous. And in this case, inadequate law enforcement in Russia. So I think we all have a picture of what biodiversity looks like. It looks sort of nice. It's sort of connected things. It's sort of pink mammals in Africa and blue dolphins and stuff like that. And you know, we all appreciate that. But the reality is that there are huge risks to the interconnectedness of the natural world. Yeah, so we have this idea of interconnected nature and all sustaining itself, if you like. And the risk is that we are damaging that. The really weird thing about biodiversity, and I wonder if you've ever thought about this, is that we rely on so few species as human beings. Claire earlier was talking about eating, you know, dandelions and having chamomile tea. But do you ever thought how few plants we use for food? You know, we rely as a human race for more or less on about 12 key crops and about 15 animals, you know, cows, pigs, and chickens, you know, and, you know, that's it. You know, we really rely on so few of the animals and plants on our planet compared with, you know, 2 million species or so that we've got around to describing. And that reliance on just a few species, of course, leaves us open to issues and problems. So let me try and answer my question. I hope you're still listening, not too many wordy slides. So why do we need biodiversity? Because it provides us with a resilient and sustainable planet that fosters good health for all of us. But what are the costs of losing it? You know, has anybody put a value on it? So why does biodiversity have a value? That's really what I was trying to answer. So our quality of life depends on the natural environment. Biodiversity contributes to our economy because it provides us with goods like fish and wood that we can use, and crops, and services like clean water and clean air, and you know, a controlled climate. So we talk about ecosystem goods and services. That's sort of jargon, but actually the goods are just, you know, the crops and things that we harvest and eat, and the services are the environment that we sort of take for granted, unfortunately. As an example, you know, pollinators pollinate crops, and you know, things like orchards and apples and fruit, and lots of crops like, you know, oilseed rape need pollination in order to produce their harvest of seeds or fruit. And you know, we shouldn't take those pollinators for granted. If we lose them, then that is a real problem. So biodiversity is also about how it feels to us to live on the planet, and the attractiveness of the planet, the aesthetics of the planet. You know, it's all about our well-being. And finally, just to say that losing biodiversity and because of degrading habitats can make zoonotic diseases more likely. Now, zoonotic is a big word, but essentially that means that they're diseases that go from one animal to another. And I think all of us are aware that COVID, as a pandemic, we believe has transferred from bat populations into human populations. And the cause of that transfer of disease from one species to another is very often the degrading of habitats, the fact that humans on the edge of urban environments are living in degraded habitats where animals and humans are coming together, and there's more opportunity for spread between the two. So I mentioned ecosystem goods and services, and again, to the big old complicated diagram, so apologies, but these are our ecosystem goods, you know, fish and wood and, you know, recreation and meat. And then our ecosystem services are things like flood control that we get from, you know, having rivers that retain water, storm protection, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and so on. So we just to sort of talk about ecosystem goods and services. Here's a quote from Sir David Attenborough, who says, there are some 4 million different kinds of animals and plants in the world, 4 million different solutions to the problems of staying alive. And he's reminding us that plants produce drugs, plants produce chemicals, very often that keep them alive, that are very important to their survival. But sometimes we can harvest those chemicals and use them as pharmaceutical drugs for our own purposes to treat particular diseases, like cancer, for instance. So we shouldn't unwittingly lose plants. They are really beneficial to our well-being. And then once we've lost them, then those chemicals are gone for good. So here's a slide which I borrowed from another speaker. Why do zoonotic diseases emerge? So, as I said, these are diseases which spread from maybe bats or monkeys into either farm animals or into humans. And can you see up here, this is 30% of newly emerging infectious diseases in humans are the result of land use changes. Okay, so it is the destruction of habitats near to cities, the clearing of forests, humans living, you know, cheek by jowl with the forest, which is a real problem and a real issue. And we believe that COVID has come from that. Imagine the destructive power of COVID and previous diseases like SARS and MERS and Ebola. You know, all of those diseases are diseases which have transferred from animals. And most diseases that humans suffer from, you know, the vast majority are zoonotic diseases, so at one time or another. So here's the World Economic Forum and a web page. And again, I'll give you the link to this if you're interested. 5 ways biodiversity matters to jobs, health, and the economy. And they talk about how it ensures health and food security. That's an ecosystem good. It helps fight disease in the way we just described. If we don't damage forests and environments, then zoonotic diseases will be prevented. It benefits businesses and also provides livelihoods. Businesses like ecotourism, for instance, and some coral reefs generate a huge amount of money from the tourism that they get in a normal year, not at the moment, of course. But also ecosystems provide livelihoods for people, not just agriculture, but tribal peoples who live, let's say, in the Amazon and harvest nature in that way. And it also helps to protect us from climate change and from erosion from waves. So coral reefs and mangrove swamps protect coastlines, and losing them is disastrous. So how do we assess the value of this? And how do we do it if we're in a developed country? How do we do this without seeming to be like an imperial power going along and you know, saying, you know, well, you mustn't do anything to your forest because you're damaging the environment, knowing full well that you know, we've already had our industrial revolution and cut down most of our trees and so on. So let me just talk a little bit about coral reefs very quickly. Amazingly diverse, you know, if you like the rainforests of the ocean. And let me just explain a little bit of what coral is. You probably know. Corals are colonies of tiny living animals, and they're made by polyps. And a polyp is like essentially an upside down jellyfish. And they, interesting because they secrete this carbonate exoskeleton, which is what is going to make the coral reef underneath it. And they grow best in warm, shallow, clear, sunny waters. So that's our coral polyp there. And can you see the calcium carbonate skeleton around the bottom of it? And here are the tentacles, which are hoping to catch the prey. And they are amazingly diverse in what they do and how they look, incredibly colorful. And what's really interesting about coral and why they're so important is that they live together inside the coral, the polyp. Can you see these little sort of orange smudges? They are algae, and they're photosynthesizing algae. So we have an animal here which is living side by side with an alga, and that makes it a symbiotic relationship, two organisms living together. So that's why they need sunlight, and that's why they grow best in shallow water, and certainly they don't grow much below 60 meters or so. And they fix large amounts of carbon, by which I mean they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, courtesy of the algae, the zooxanthellae, and they make it into carbonate. And that's, of course, exactly what we need to do in the planet, to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere rather than putting it back from burning fossil fuels. So that's where the coral reefs are, mostly between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. They're incredibly diverse, almost as diverse as rainforests. And they are the canaries in the coal mine of our planetary crisis, by which I mean that when the corals are looking ill, then we know there's something wrong with the planet. They are so biodiverse that if we lose them, then we lose a huge number of species, but also a whole load of people lose their livelihood because people rely on the productivity of coral reefs for their fisheries and so on. So what's amazing about coral reefs is that they only occupy about 0.1% of the ocean, yet they provide a habitat for 3/4 of all, 3/4 of all marine species. Sorry, a third quarter, 3/4 is what I mean. They shield thousands of kilometers of coastline from the wave action. They generate a huge amount of tourism. Tourism accounts for 11% of the GDP in Egypt, for instance. Dive sites attract 3 to 4 million tourists every year in Sharm el Sheikh. And some of the poorest people in the world rely on coral. And the problem with acidification is it really affects coral badly. And it's been described as global warming's equally evil twin, which I quite like that phrase. So what are the pressures on coral? Well, overfishing, and I'll show you a couple of slides in a minute. And some of the overfishing is catastrophic. It involves using dynamite and cyanide in order to kill fish, to lure fish out of the coral. Poor land use and deforestation, chemical pollution is affecting coral, and a whole load of pressures from development as well. So this is somebody throwing in dynamite into a coral reef, and he's just going to gather up the fish, but of course he will have hugely damaged the coral. These are sort of masked people who are putting cyanide into crevices to bring out fish, and they bring out fish which are a little bit, well, literally off color, a little bit ill. They will then sell those fish on to aquarists who keep fish in tanks, but they won't survive for very long. But it's, again, a very damaging action. And then things like anchor cables can cause a huge amount of damage on the floor if we're not careful. And this is coral that's been harvested for the tourist industry. Again, not very good. And coral suffers from this thing called coral bleaching. As the ocean warms up, the coral bleaches. The algae leave the coral. We don't quite know exactly why, what's the trigger for that. But bleaching is a real problem. And there have been bleaching events, for instance, in 1998, where 20% of the world coral lost its zooxanthellae. And in that case, the coral reef is going to stop growing. There is wide agreement among scientists that coral reefs are going to be mostly lost by 2050. So probably not, before I might not live that long, but you guys are going to see catastrophic loss of coral reefs, and that's really sad. This is what coral bleaching looks like in the in this case here, and lots of bleaching there. So the amount of coral has decreased by 50% between 1983 and 2012. 30% of carbon dioxide emissions have been absorbed by oceans since 1800, so they're really important. But they're becoming more and more acid, and the pH will, we think, drop by 0.4 by the end of the century. And CO2 levels will reach 560 parts per million and then corals will find it incredibly difficult to grow. I'm nearly finished. I hope you've stayed with me, and I'm sorry I've rambled on a little bit, but I just want to say a little bit about endangeredness and islands, because it's something I'm particularly interested in. When I talk about islands, I don't just mean islands in the sense of, something in the middle of the ocean, because as an ecologist, you think of islands being a lake, being an island. It's like a surrounded area, or a cave, or a mountaintop can be an island for the species which live on it, or a seamount, a mountain under the sea, if you like, or a forest, or, it's particularly when those bits of forest become cut up and fragmented, as we were saying. So islands are really important, again, for biodiversity. So islands in the oceanic sense comprise about 3.5% of Earth's land area, but they have about 15 to 20% of terrestrial species. So they're sort of interesting places. So if we look at continents and islands, so the continents are the green bars and the islands are the black bars, and these are the animal extinctions through the recent sort of historical past. And you can see how islands have been hit much harder than continents, even though, as we just said, islands are only a very small part of the entire land area. So we need to be particularly concerned about islands and looking after island populations there. And again, it's the same sort of data here. So this is island species and their extinction rates, and you can just see how they're really picking up, particularly in birds here. We got, look at the figures for birds there. So this is the number of extinctions on islands since 1500. Okay. So once again, once the species are gone on the island, then they're not going to be recolonized. The island population is very small, they're very vulnerable to random events, and there are always human pressures on space and habitat, particularly in islands. So I'm nearly there. Thank you for listening. This is an interesting idea of 5 things we can do, 5 things that we can take action on as a planet by scientists writing in 2019. And they say, the first thing we should do is increase yields in developing nations. So improve our agriculture, because very often crop yields in developing countries are only a fraction of what they could be. So, growing more on the existing land would mean we didn't need to clear the land. So you might think it's a bit odd advocating more intensive use of land, but in this particular case, the point is we just want to use the land we got. We don't want to use it, clear any more forest. We want to reduce food waste, something we can all do a lot more about. Buying sensibly, smarter farming. So even in the developing countries, putting on fertilizer on only when it's needed and at the right times. Adopting healthier diets, which is something we can all do. Eating meat, for instance, puts huge pressures on global footprints and so on. So trying to eat more vegetarian food and reducing greenhouse gas and reducing climate change. So 5 steps that they advocate here. Let me leave you with a couple of quotes which I particularly like, and they're both from American Native Indians. So the earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. All things are connected, like the blood that unites us all. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. Really sort of wise words. And another Indian proverb, North American Indian proverb. Only when the last tree has died and the last river has been poisoned and the last fish has been caught will we realize we cannot eat money. So there are some links, and I can leave these with Claire, and she can send those around. And I don't know whether there's a recording of this talk as well that could be made available, but here are some links that you might like to look at. The IUCN produced a red list of endangered species, and I think just spend 15-20 minutes having a look at this, I think will make us all realize just how on the edge we are living on this planet, and that we can do something about it. So that was me, and I hope that was helpful and relevant, and I didn't talk too fast or say too much, but there we go. Thanks very much.
It was brilliant, George. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot from that talk, and so much information. And yes, I have recorded this, so obviously I will probably re-watch certain sections, and I'm sure that a number of our students will be watching this after the live event as well. But you made so many valid points, and you know, you've given me ideas. Hopefully, you've given some of the students ideas, the things that they want to change or make changes within their school grounds and their local community, or even just at home as well. You know, one of the points that you made, which I thought was particularly relevant, which we could replicate at a school, is obviously, you know, making other students aware, like you were saying, the amount of actually food that we eat. And again, sometimes, so Sophie says this is cultural sometimes, you know, you go into a supermarket and you see, you know, the aisles of fruit and veg. It's a tiny percentage. The veg that we have on offer is so, you know, minimal when you actually think about the veg that we can actually be growing in this country, and which a lot of people do grow in their allotments, and native vegetables as well, for example. So, you know, that's something which if some of the students wanted to do, you know, create an allotment with native or you know, different types of species of vegetables, for example, to raise awareness of what can be grown. And then maybe seed collection, that's another thing. Sharing of seeds is another really easy option that we could implement. So, you know, I'm really excited to see what the ideas our students have and what they come up with for their schools and their communities. So thank you, George. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to all of the speakers. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you all have too.